Tim, I'm the Senior Director of Strategy for Free Press, and I've been at Free Press for 10 years. My background is in journalism, and a lot of what I'll be talking about in the next 20 minutes regards journalism, but kind of a new form of journalism called open journalism that a lot of people have been discussing of late. So Free Press, as an organization, and our tagline is that we fight for everyone's right to connect and communicate. And increasingly what that means in the way that we organize our work internally is that we work on two issues. We work on internet freedom. Basically everyone must have access to open, affordable, and fast internet networks where they can communicate without fear of censorship or surveillance. And we work on press freedom. That is the idea that the health of our democracy depends on free speech protections, diverse media ownership, and quality journalism. Now, increasingly, these two issues overlap for us. In a world where most information is migrating online, concepts of internet freedom and press freedom merge. For us, it doesn't matter whether you're a credentialed, professionally trained journalist or an everyday citizen with a smartphone and a connection. Everyone has the potential to engage in acts of journalism, and any act of journalism must be protected regardless of who's doing it. The open internet must also be protected as it is a platform where both voices of dissent and acts of journalism are shared. So what does press and internet freedom in a networked world mean? In 2011, when Egyptian activist Wael Ghanim was asked this question, he said basically that if you want to liberate a society, you give them the internet. In retrospect, Ghanim's should have qualified his statement to include the kind of internet that free societies need. For as online dissent and open journalism have spread, governments have heightened efforts to remake digital networks as tools of censorship and surveillance. The optimism about the internet that emerged during Egypt's Arab Spring has been dashed by the Morsi and Sisi regimes, which have silenced some online media and imprisoned dozens of journalists. In January of this year, Egypt's Interior Ministry drafted legislation that would censor websites that instigate terrorism, in their own words. Sites the ministry singled out for monitoring included Facebook, which has become a popular channel for Egyptians to report local news, connect with a larger community, and voice their dissent. It's a pattern of expression and repression that repeats itself elsewhere. By many accounts, Turkey's Gezi Park protests in 2013 were the country's high water mark for online organizing and reporting. But after it cleared the park, the Erdogan government imposed a ban on Twitter and YouTube. While a constitutional court decision rescinded the Twitter ban, the repression is yet to stop. The regime has shuttered local websites without court orders and collected web browsing data on individuals. In Kiev, some of the best reporting during the Euromaidan protests came from a community of live streamers, people using smartphone cameras, streaming apps, and network connections to provide viewers online with a live video record of protests. And yet the aftermath in Ukraine has featured a crackdown against journalists so severe that the country has dropped 10 spots in Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index. And in Hong Kong, organizers of Occupy Central have used mobile apps such as FireChat to enable smartphones to speak directly to each other without relying on a working cellular or Wi-Fi connection. And yet from Hong Kong, we've also received numerous reports of cell phone messages that have been specifically crafted to entice Occupy Central protesters to download apps that appear designed to coordinate communications, to download apps that appear designed to coordinate communications, but are actually spyware used to record phone calls, monitor emails, capture contacts, and track the user's geographical position. In some, communications for these pro-democracy protests has evolved into a digital game of cat and mouse. Journalists and activists have to devise ingenious ways to get around firewalls while repressive authorities deploy new technologies to turn the web into a surveillance and censorship machine. Today, in 2014, when asked whether the internet has been a force for good or evil, scholar Zeynep Tufekci simply answers yes. What Zeynep means is that the internet freedoms won't survive unless people everywhere mobilize to protect our rights. I realize that to break this cycle of expression and repression, we must look deeper at the tools protesters and reporters use and ask whether they further the cause of internet and press freedom or just make these network journalists and activists more vulnerable. So I've spent a considerable amount of time with Occupy movements worldwide, starting with the Occupy Wall Street protests in New York City. During those protests, I took pictures of people speaking to the public. I took pictures of people holding signs and of people speaking to the media while holding signs. I took thousands of photographs, and as I was sorting through these images, I noticed something. In my pictures, the media were everywhere, but it wasn't traditional media, though they showed up soon enough, but something that Harvard's Jonathan Zittrain calls generative media. There were digital cameras and recorders, but the most ubiquitous form of media was, of course, the smartphone. People were using smartphones to take pictures, make calls, check emails, and text friends. But they're also using them to record authorities as they arrested people. Oftentimes, these journalists were themselves targeted for participating in these acts of journalism. My colleague Josh Stearns kept a running tally of these journalist arrests. By the time the Occupy encampments had been cleared from public areas around the US, more than 75 journalists had been arrested. The Occupy movement itself was very savvy with the media. They had set up their own media center in Zuccotti Park to get information about Occupy out to the public. The goal of the media center was to create and share information without having to rely on traditional media outlets or what they called the mainstream media filter. And they were immensely successful at this, but their use of new network media to circumvent old traditional media presented a new set of risks. Here's how it worked. For many, the goal was to connect events on the streets with people wherever they were. To do that, the protesters and journalists relied upon social media connected to wireless networks. This information loop had 4 layers of intersection. 1, it began with the devices used by citizens or citizen journalists or anyone on the scene documenting news and information from the movement. 2, that information was then shared using social media applications. Popular applications included YouTube, Twitter, Storify, and Facebook, among others, but some were also using more sophisticated means, such as video streaming apps like Ustream or Livestream. 3, those applications rode on wireless networks. In the US, these services are provided by a small handful of telecommunications giants, companies like AT&T and Verizon with few other options. And finally, the last layer of this network was, of course, loop was, of course, the audience, who in the world of social media are more than mere passive observers, but able to comment back on information and start a new conversation. When this worked well, they created a virtual feedback loop, where information on the scene was shared with many using social media's unique properties. Those people could then amplify the message by sharing the information with others or responding to ask a question of the reporter on the ground. But this loop did not always work. As we have learned, there are serious vulnerabilities at each layer. At the devices layer, we saw people getting harassed and arrested for attempting to document protests and related police activities. These devices made them vulnerable to all sorts of snooping. Authorities use sophisticated technology that can intercept or block smartphone communications, steal your data, and even pinpoint the location of speakers. Social media accounts and mobile applications are often blocked or suspended, leaving speakers at the mercy of companies like Facebook, YouTube, Apple, and Twitter, who use opaque terms of service to exert control over users. The threat of blocking at the network level is also very real as internet service providers encroach on net neutrality, limit data plans, block competitive services, and share with authorities the metadata of their customers. And finally, there's the issue of audiences. According to the International Telecommunications Union, only 40% of the world's population uses the internet. The highest rates of usage are concentrated in developed countries. In contrast, only 16% of people in Africa have access. So what do we need to overcome these threats? What do we need to complete the loop? Let's look to solutions at each point, starting with the devices. Occupy introduced to many a new breed of journalists. This was typified by Tim Pool, who was a young college graduate who began to sleep at the Occupy encampment in New York City. He started live streaming events via his device. He set up a battery pack that allowed him to live stream for more than 20 hours at a time. It carried around in his backpack, and Pool's coverage of the Occupy protest was so thorough and fresh that his feed was picked up and syndicated by multiple mainstream outlets, including NBC, Reuters, Al Jazeera, and Time. He was there doing it better and far more cheaply than the so-called professional news crews, and Tim was just one among many citizen journalists to come forward during the Occupy movement. Today you'll find an increasing amount of breaking news is first reported by people who happen to be on the scene using their smartphones to record and distribute information. But Tim and his ilk were soon targeted by police. Whenever there was an arrest, a scrum of citizen journalists would materialize from the crowd to document the police action. They had gotten so good at it that those arrested often used the resulting videos to challenge their arrests before the courts. Many had their charges successfully dropped based on this evidence. Soon police began targeting this new breed of journalists for arrest, but police officers claimed that it had become more and more difficult to distinguish new media or citizen journalists from credentialed ones. The line separating journalists from protesters had dissolved. So on the device level of this feedback loop, there are a couple of things that we can do in structure and policy. We must support policies that defend everyone's right to record under law. This often means opposing the state laws that say you must gain a public official's permission before documenting his or her as she does her job. And it means getting the U.S. Department of Justice to clarify everyone's First Amendment right to record, something they have done on a few instances. It also means adopting better technologies and practices so that journalists can safeguard devices from shutdown and surveillance. There are a number of organizations that are doing very good work on this. And it also means educating both journalists and local police forces about everyone's right to record. So the next layer in the loop is applications. At the application point, there are a host of problems. While applications like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube look like public spaces, they're not. Ethan Zuckerman of MIT's Center for Civic Media describes this situation well when he said, hosting your political movement on YouTube is a little like trying to hold a rally in a shopping mall. It looks like a public space, but it's not. It's a private space, and your use of it is governed by an agreement that works harder to protect YouTube's fiscal viability than to protect your rights of free speech. Zuckerman compared social media applications to benevolent despots, able to block your messages at will. They're private platforms, and our use of them is governed not by the First Amendment protections, but by their corporate terms of service. Oops, excuse me. The explosion of social media is something that's been called the privatization of discourse. More than 1 billion people are speaking via these platforms, but it's ushered in an age where functionaries at YouTube and Facebook have unprecedented power to censor without accountability. And we have since learned, courtesy of whistleblower Edward Snowden, that these private platforms have been at the mercy of government intelligence agencies, which have pressured them to hand over information about users. Not only does this raise questions about our Fourth Amendment rights, but it also has a chilling effect on free speech. So in order to make applications safe, we need organized public pressure in the US. There have been many mixed results developing an internet users' rights movement that aims to join social media users like a union. Their goal would be to influence corporate terms of service so that sites such as Facebook and Twitter would have to seek user feedback before changing user terms. In this way, terms of service becomes more like a mutually agreed upon contract. 2, we need to establish and enforce corporate standards for protecting free speech. The Global Network Initiative is a voluntary effort organizing companies that face pressure by governments to censor speech. It has had some mixed results, but doesn't seem capable of getting side-on from some of the largest social media applications. To be more accountable and transparent to users, application providers must allow a full public view of every decision to block content, and these services should invite feedback from users as a check against abuses. 3rd, we need to push for privacy protection in laws. In the U.S., Congress needs to redraft and reintroduce the Electronic Communications Privacy Act with language that safeguards electronic communication records, like your email or chat logs, and the information you share with companies. The government should have to go to a judge and get a warrant that says it has probable cause to believe you committed a crime before it can read your email, browse your social networking accounts, or track your location. The USA Freedom Act is also making its way through Congress. It was supposed to amend the Patriot and FISA Amendment Acts in ways that protect user data, but many aspects of the proposed legislation remain unresolved. And finally, and third, we have networks. Unlike applications, there is a history of policies designed to protect content traveling across networks. In the US, they are rooted in a concept of common carriage, which dates to the era of railway transportation. Network neutrality is the modern day equivalent. It's a rule that prevents network owners like Comcast, AT&T, and Verizon from favoring or discriminating against any content that passes over its networks. Many have called net neutrality the First Amendment of the Internet. Without clear protections of user speech, the network operators will continue incremental efforts to take control of the network away from users. And we've also learned from Edward Snowden that the extent to which network providers like AT&T and Verizon are willing to hand over phone communications metadata to government intelligence agencies. These are real threats. Comcast blocked file sharing applications like BitTorrent and then threatened to block Netflix. Verizon's lawyers are claiming that they have a First Amendment right to edit the internet. AT&T has announced a plan to block FaceTime from certain wireless users. So what do we need to do to protect open networks? We need to enforce net neutrality under law. Central to any net neutrality rule is ensuring that internet users have the right to protect and share content without anyone else on the internet blocking. Number 2, we need to expand access to unlicensed spectrum. We can build more of the types of open and public Wi-Fi services to offer an alternative to commercial networks where discriminatory blocking poses a growing threat. Third, we can do more. We can urge more and more network providers to put in place. We can fight the tendency of network providers to put in place excessive use policies that are designed to contain user-based creativity while earning these companies even higher profit margins. The network providers have tried and failed to portray these limits or data caps as pro-consumer. In truth, they're just a way for phone and cable companies to enrich themselves while stifling online innovation. Such data caps serve no useful purpose and should be resisted. And we can, as I mentioned earlier, continue to work on amending laws that allow for mass surveillance. So the final point of this feedback loop is the audience. Despite being the birthplace of the internet, America still struggles to get everyone connected. This is a particular problem for the Occupy movement, which seeks to reach and organize lower income communities. And it's those same communities that are more likely to be offline. At the moment, nearly 20 million Americans can't get broadband as there aren't services available in their vicinity. Moreover, a third can't get online or choose not to, and just 40% of houses with incomes below $25,000 have wired internet connections. Compare this to the 93% of households with over $100,000 in annual income who have access. And in survey after survey comparing broadband prices in developed countries, we have learned that high-speed internet in the US is far more expensive. We pay a lot more for a lot less. In her book on America's Internet Challenges, Professor Susan Crawford found that internet users in Hong Kong have access to a 500 megabyte broadband connection for the equivalent of $25 a month, a figure she compares with $200 per month for a similar service here in New York City. So to promote universal access, we need to support private-public partnerships in broadband build-out. In 2009, the Obama administration implemented an economic stimulus plan that set aside nearly $4.7 billion to build internet networks that adhere to non-discrimination and openness principles. We need to make sure that municipal broadband networks can offer a cheap alternative in low-income urban communities where the private networks are reluctant to go. We need to pass legislation at the federal level that preempts industry-funded state-level efforts to block municipal broadband. And we need to bring competition into the internet access marketplace to give internet users a choice beyond the few phone and cable companies that dominate the space. Competition and choice spells lower prices. This loop involves these four layers of the devices, the applications, the network itself, and the audience. And what I'm proposing here is a linked policy structure combined with incentives in the marketplace that will allow this loop to thrive. The media technology has changed, but our free speech rights have not. Freedom of expression is more important, not less, when anyone with a mobile phone and an internet connection can participate in acts of journalism or organized dissent. Completing this feedback loop is the work I do at Free Press. Are there any questions? Yes?
I wanted to say I'm a big fan of Free Press.
Thanks.
Alex, can you hold on?
Sure.
Hello.
Try this one?
Yeah. let me try this.
See what we get at. Can you hear this?
Yeah. Now it's warmed up. It's warmed up.
Okay.
Here we go.
Okay.
Big fan of Free Press. Ran ISP Planet and ISPCon before going to Brooklyn Law School, and I follow these issues closely.
Mm-hmm.
I'm worried, though, that the new Congress will not be very attentive to them. This morning, the most quoted senator is Ted Cruz, and his sole concern is the effect of policy on corporate bottom lines. So my question to you is, how do you get these concerns, which do, I think, resonate at least with libertarian Republicans as well as Democrats, how do you get these valid concerns aired in Congress, which is really the place where action has to happen?
Well, good question. I mean, there are a couple of things happening. We've been working on that issue for about 10 years now. And even if you were a year ago to ask where the net neutrality debate was with concern to common carriage in Title II of the Communications Act, you would have got a completely different answer than you would have received today, a day after President Obama called for Title II. I would have never guessed that was going to happen. And that is a result of 10 years of organizing at the grassroots level, of organizing inside Washington. And we have, I can't release it yet because it's not coming out until tomorrow, but there's going to be, we're releasing a survey of conservatives and Republicans on the issue of net neutrality, and found that a majority of them support at least the concepts behind net neutrality. So what does that mean in terms of the new Congress? It means we are probably going to see an effort to rewrite the Telecommunications Act in 2015 by this Congress. That, as an organizer, makes me giddy because it's a lot easier to kill a bill than it is to pass one, and it's going to be a great organizing vehicle for us, not only to continue to build upon the base that we have. More than 4 million people contacted the FCC during this last proceeding, but to also reach out to the other side of the aisle where support for net neutrality is less established. So we'll see a fight in Congress, and it'll be an interesting organizing opportunity to, in my view, to move more people on the right side of the aisle towards this issue. Any other questions? We'll start with David and we'll you want to try this one?
I'll try this one.
Doesn't
Hello? Oh, this works. Hey, okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead here and bring Nate Easley into the conversation. Nate has a new initiative with the idea of a corporate code of social responsibility, particularly focused.
I'll ask questions about net neutrality
Yeah.
before we move forward.
Okay. Let me finish here. Okay, I'll be quick. And so, Nate, do you think that your concept of this code of ethics for corporations, specifically the tech companies, might lend itself to the kind of initiatives that Tim is talking about in terms of civil liberties and free expression?
Yes.
Oh, this is a good question.
And the extended answer
Yeah.
is about 25 minutes long.
It's later.
That's
Right.
exactly what they're talking about.
there's another, I didn't mention it earlier, but Rebecca McKinnon, I don't know if this is related to what you're working on. Rebecca McKinnon, who has worked in the international space on internet freedom issues, is also putting together a corporate index that's based on a number of human rights factors, including internet freedom related factors. So I'm not quite sure where she is on that, maybe more than I do about that, but they're planning also to create this performance index that may add another degree of pressure on corporations.
Okay.
We'll start with you and then
Hi, I'm Tom Lowenhaupt, and I work with an organization called Connecting.nyc, and we focus on the development of the .nyc top-level domain as a public interest resource. And I guess my comment/unfair question is about, your work is global and in nature, or national at least, and most everything internet is by its nature global. But these top-level domains such as .nyc open spaces that address the second layer here of the applications. You referred to Facebook and Twitter as closed gardens or whatever, and with the local TLDs with .nyc, we can have spaces that we control here if we get engaged. And the unfair question is so that, so for example, neighborhood names, so every neighborhood in the city, every name has been set aside for the development of the local population, for discussions, for publishing, for whatever we want, as long as we stick our noses in and say, well, we want these names. You set them aside, give these names to us, let us develop them, let us make our neighborhoods places where that we control, that we develop our future in. And do you see a way for an organization like yours to get involved with the local and see that, while it's New York City now, it's going to be 300 cities in a few years. And if we can have standards globally that says that these city TLDs are democratic institutions, that they empower the local residents, that they are actually the bottom up of the internet, and they have a role in governing the internet, can you support that idea, and how
Absolutely.
could you do that?
we can support it. We're an organization of about 35 people, which somewhat limits our ability to be that granular at the grassroots level. However, we do work on policies at both the federal and state level that would enable that thing. One interesting opportunity, I don't know if you've had a chance to read Susan Crawford's new book on responsive cities, but I would recommend it, is this idea of revisiting local franchise agreements. Deals struck between cities and their local cable company, and in exchange for right-of-way, they have to provide public access television. It's usually the return that cities get. I think we need to revisit those and ask that ISPs that are using rights-of-way also invest in the kind of capacity that you're talking about. The ability to create these kind of local networks that are independent, that use the infrastructure and engage people at a very local level in policy and organizing and things like that.
Thank you. I just would comment, just turn this thing on. And I just comment for those here that I mentioned that the city is actively engaged in developing these local neighborhoods, and if anybody is interested in a neighborhood and seeing how that name could be used and developed, please talk to me.
Thank you.
Working? Yeah. I don't know, are you on Dave Farber's list?
No, I'm not.
No. So, he's anti-net neutrality, and
Yes.
there's another professor and so on. And so they were ranting, in the last couple of days. And one of the themes was that in other countries, net neutrality, when they see regulation coming down, one thing, they think regulation is bad, period. But two, when they see America regulating the internet, that'll give them the excuse to regulate the internet, and that bad things will happen in the name of net neutrality globally. Can you respond to that?
The bad things have been happening because of the wrong regulations since 2002 and 2003, when then chairman of the FCC, Michael Powell, made the wrong decision to reclassify internet access providers as information services. What we're asking for is a correction to put internet service providers, this is a very important point, we're asking that internet service providers be regulated, not internet content. That is one of the reasons why we've been so adamant about Title II and less interested in, and I'm sorry if you're not following the legal debate, issues like Section 706, which actually gives the FCC vague authority to regulate internet content. What we're asking for is a clear common carriage rule, non-discrimination rule for internet service providers, and that is a way of protecting content in ways that should be a strong example for other countries.
Do you think that because of the confusion between content and transport that, some form of structural separation is desirable?
I'm a big supporter of structural separation, and the issue. You could probably do a better job than I, but it's a common carriage is kind of a gesture towards structural separation. It's the idea that the transport layer and the content layer are separate entities. And what common carriage accomplishes is that it puts on the pipe providers a standard that means that they have to treat all content without discrimination. So I agree that is a laudable long-term goal because we're sort of in the trenches of Washington, D.C., trying to accomplish what is possible. We're fighting that battle around the issue of common carriage in Title II. Anything else? Thank you.